Hello again. One of the things which I have always found immensely annoying is the way in which experts and clever people generally use a lot of long sentences and polysyllabic words to confuse their listeners about some subject or other which is actually very straightforward and easy to understand. Sometimes this is done because such people wish to sound clever, and really they're just showing off their vocabularies and mastery of English. But more often than not, it is because they are hiding something or trying to cheat you. Electricians and motor mechanics, of course, engage in the same trick, where they describe something in technical jargon that you cannot make head nor tail of before hitting you with a large bill for work which is absolutely vital if your car is not to break down or your house go up in flames. Precisely the same thing, of course, is done by politicians when they're anxious to sell you something or wish to prevent your understanding some scam they are working. Which brings me naturally to the National Health Service. We all know, of course, that the NHS is a basket case and getting worse day by day. But nobody will ever tell the public just why that is. The government is claiming that the problem is there is too much profligacy and waste, and that hospitals are squandering their budgets on diversity and inclusion, and that if only there were not so many managers and office staff, then all would be well. Left-wing types, on the other hand, say it's all the fault of 14 years of Tory cuts, and that if only we spent more money on the health service and less on the armed forces, then everything would be fine for the National Health Service, which is, of course, the envy of the world. Both right-wingers and left-wingers are lying their heads off, and none of this has anything at all to do with the case. Let me explain what is actually wrong. I'll need to go back a few years to do so, but only briefly. Because the NHS is such a gigantic organisation, it's pointless to try and look at it overall when assessing the nature of the difficulties. Far better to look at a single aspect of the thing and then extrapolate from that. Let's think then only of casualty departments, or A&Es as they are now known, and let's limit ourselves to North East London. In North London 40 years ago, in 1984, there was one casualty department at the North Middlesex Hospital. If you lived in Edmonton, Tottenham, Wood Green, round there, this was where you went in an emergency. A few miles away, in East London, was Whipps Cross Hospital. If you lived in Walthamstow, Leighton, Leytonstone, Woodford, Hyams Park, Buckhurst Hill or Chigwell and needed to go to casualty, you went to Whipps Cross. In 1984, those two casualty departments worked brilliantly, and one seldom had to wait more than 20 minutes or half an hour at most to be seen. I know this because I used to both of those casualty departments at that time in connection with my work. They were fine. At that time, in 1984, the population of London was about 6.5 million, and those two hospitals were adequate to provide a good service for that number of people. Today, the population of London is over 10 million. That is to say that it has risen by 50%. However, those two hospitals are still the only casualty departments covering that huge swathe of North and East London. The population in that area, the areas served by those hospitals, has risen by 50%. No new casualty departments have opened there in the last 40 years. That means that although there are now 50% more people than there were 40 years ago there, the service they are using is the same as the one which was operating 40 years ago with far fewer people. I'm sure that everybody understands this. It means that all the services in those two hospitals including the casualty departments, are now crowded to the point that the service they provide is absolutely appalling. If the population of London had remained the same or grown by natural increase, that is to say the number of births being a little higher than the number of deaths, then the provision in the North Middlesex and Whipps Cross hospitals would still be good enough. This is not what has happened, though. The 50% rise in the number of people in London has been brought about by unplanned immigration, and it is this, the huge numbers of new people living in the areas around the two hospitals, which has created the problem. That's why the waiting time at the casualty department at Whipps Cross Hospital, up by Snaresbrook, is now enormously long, and we're talking 8 or 12 hours here. I've mentioned before that in towns which have only grown by natural increase, the hospitals which were functioning well 40 years ago are still fine and cope without difficulty. That's because 40 years ago they had a certain number of people using the casualty departments, and 40 years later today they still have that number of people. So cuts don't make any difference to that, nor do diversity and inclusion managers or waste or anything. They work exactly the same as they did 40 years ago. There is another point to consider, which is that many of the people who have moved to London from abroad come from impoverished countries, and their citizens who come here are often in poorer health than the average British person born in this country. Because of this, many of the extra 50% of people living in London who have come over in the last 40 years use hospitals, including the casualty departments, far more than the native population are apt to do. This too serves to make the casualty departments very crowded. I have deliberately limited myself to discussing a single part of the National Health Service in just one part of London. But of course the same situation exists in other cities and towns across Britain. Because the massive increase in population was unplanned and disorganised, it has been impossible to predict where the greatest need will be, or to say how many people will be arriving in Bradford or Lincoln or Ipswich or Birmingham or anywhere else. All these places also suffer from the same difficulties which are seen in those parts of the capital about which I have been talking. There is nothing in the slightest degree complicated about what is happening within the NHS, but nobody will talk about it or acknowledge that this is what is happening. For this reason, there is not the least prospect of the situation improving, because nobody will deal with the situation or agree what is actually wrong. Things can only, and will only, get worse.